The gun was already pressed against Paul Hadley's temple when Sallie Archer walked through the saloon doors. She did not flinch. She did not scream. She looked at the man holding the weapon Cutter Briggs, hired gun, wanted in 3 territories, and she said, with a voice as steady as the Kansas plains themselves, "Put that down before you make the worst mistake of your short life." The room had gone absolutely still. 30 men and not a single one of them breathing. The oil lamps threw orange shadows across Paul's face, and Sallie could see the dark line of blood already forming at his hairline, where Cutter had struck him with the barrel. She could see Paul's jaw tightening, not from fear but from fury at himself, at the fact that he had been caught off guard, that she had walked in to find him like this, that he could not protect her from what was unfolding. Cutter Briggs laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Mrs. Archer, or is it still Miss Archer? Hard to keep track with a widow who refuses to stay quiet." "It is Miss Archer," she said, "and I am not refusing to stay quiet. I am refusing to let you strangle what little justice is left in Harlow's Creek." Something moved in Paul Hadley's eyes then. Even pressed against a gun, even bleeding, there was something in him that shifted, something that looked almost like awe. He had known Sallie Archer for exactly 11 months, 2 weeks and 4 days, though he would have told no one he had been counting. He had watched her build a school out of nothing, face down a corrupt land agent, and feed half the town through a drought. He had told himself he admired her the way a man admires a well-made fence, useful, solid, a thing to be respected from a distance. Standing in the doorway of the Horseshoe Saloon with 30 men watching her and a loaded Colt inches from his skull, Paul Hadley understood with sudden, brutal clarity that he was not admiring her from any distance at all. He was in love with her. And he had hidden it so well, behind duty and propriety, and the carefully maintained lie that a marshal with a dark past had no business wanting anything good, that he had nearly taken the secret to his grave. "Last warning," Sallie said to Cutter Briggs, and then she reached under her shawl and produced a Winchester rifle that had no business being hidden there, aimed it without trembling, and said, "Every man in this room knows what you did to the Ray's family. Every man in this room knows you burned their homestead on Hargrove's orders. That makes you a murderer and an arsonist, and the law in this territory says I can hold a citizen's right to detain until the marshal is free to do his job." She tilted her head toward Paul. "He looks a little occupied at the moment, so I am doing the holding." The room held its breath for 3 full seconds. Cutter Briggs lowered the gun, but that was not where the story began, not even close. To understand how Sallie Archer came to be the woman standing in that saloon with a Winchester and a will of iron, you have to go back to the summer of 1882, to the beginning of everything. To the first morning a woman stepped off a stagecoach in Harlow's Creek, Kansas, with 2 children, a carpetbag, and a grief so large it had reshaped her entirely. The summer of 1882 was merciless in the way that Kansas summers always were. The sun came up early and stayed late, and it did not ask permission. Harlow's Creek sat at the edge of Comanche County, a town that had been built with ambition and was slowly being hollowed out by corruption. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a church whose pastor had fled the previous winter, a school with no teacher, a saloon that never closed, and a population of approximately 200 souls who were all, in one way or another, afraid. The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday. Sallie Archer stepped down first, one hand on the door frame, her dark eyes already scanning the street with the practiced alertness of a woman who had learned not to be surprised by disappointment. She was 29 years old, with dark hair pinned under a gray traveling bonnet and a dress that had once been very fine and was now simply clean and well-mended. She was not tall, but she carried herself as though height were irrelevant. Behind her came her children, Thomas, who was 8 and serious and had his father's gray eyes, and Clara, who was 5 and held a rag doll named Evangeline with the fierce protectiveness of someone guarding treasure. Sallie had grown up in St. Louis, married a schoolteacher named Robert Archer who had believed deeply in the promise of the West, moved with him to Kansas, watched that promise turn to ash when Robert died of a fever the previous December, and arrived in Harlow's Creek on the strength of a letter from a distant cousin who had written, "There is opportunity here, if a woman is brave enough to take it." Her cousin had not mentioned that the opportunity required negotiating with men who thought women's opinions were a form of weather, something to be endured until it passed. The first person Sallie met in Harlow's Creek was not Paul Hadley. It was Vera Dunn, the postmistress, a stout woman in her 50s with spectacles and a voice that carried like a church bell. "You are the teacher," Vera said, not as a question. "I applied for the position," Sallie said carefully. "I have not yet been hired." "You are the teacher," Vera repeated, as though Sallie had said something nonsensical. "The school board has precisely no other candidates and 11 children who have not had proper lessons in 4 months. You will do." It was, in its way, the warmest welcome Harlow's Creek had to offer. The school was a single room with 4 long benches, a cast iron stove that would be needed in winter, and a blackboard that had been cracked down the middle so that every letter written on it looked as though it were splitting apart. Sallie spent her first 3 days cleaning it, repairing what she could with what she had, and sending Thomas and Clara to sleep in the single room behind the schoolhouse that would serve as their home. She met Paul Hadley on her 4th day. He came to the school not because of the school itself, but because 2 of his deputies had gotten into a fistfight outside it at noon, and one of them had stumbled through the door and collapsed a bench. He arrived to collect them both, gave Sallie a careful, measuring look, and said with a formality that seemed habitual, "Marshal Paul Hadley, ma'am. I apologize for the disruption." She looked at the shattered bench. She looked at the deputy, who had a black eye and was holding his nose. She looked at Paul Hadley, who was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a Marshal star on his chest, and the kind of watchful stillness she associated with men who had seen things they did not discuss. "Marshal," she said, "can one of your deputies use a saw?" He blinked. "I believe Deputy Monroe has some carpentry skills, yes." "Then send him back this afternoon to fix what he broke," she said, and turned back to her blackboard. Paul Hadley stood in the doorway of the schoolroom for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," and left. Deputy Monroe returned that afternoon and fixed the bench. He also fixed the loose door hinge and the broken window latch that Sallie had not mentioned, because Paul had apparently told him to look for things that needed doing. She noticed that. She filed it away. The first month in Harlow's Creek taught Sallie 3 things. First, that the town's corruption ran deeper than a single bad actor. It was systemic, a rot that had started with the land agent, Silas Hargrove, who held mortgages on half the buildings in town and used them as leverage to keep people quiet. Second, that the people of Harlow's Creek were not fundamentally bad. They were frightened, which was different and more treatable. Third, that Paul Hadley was a more complicated man than his uniform suggested. She learned the third thing slowly, the way you learn anything that matters. She saw it in the way he handled disputes, not with force first, but with questions. She saw it when he brought sugar candy to Clara after the little girl cried openly in the street, because a boy at school had said her father was dead, and that was why they were poor. She saw it when he sat with old Mr. Dawson for 2 hours after the man's horse died, not because it was his duty, but because Mr. Dawson had no one else. She also learned about his past, in pieces, the way a town always gives up its secrets in whispers and half-truths, and the things people said when they did not know she was listening. Paul Hadley had come to Harlow's Creek 3 years ago, appointed by the county sheriff over the objections of Silas Hargrove, who had preferred a more manageable man for the position. Before that, Paul had been a deputy in Abilene during the worst years of the cattle trail violence years, in which he had done things that were legal and necessary, and that still visited him at night in ways he never talked about. He had been engaged once, to a woman named Anne who had left for Denver and married a banker, and the general consensus of the town seemed to be that this had made him careful in ways that occasionally tipped into coldness. Sallie did not think it was coldness. She thought it was the posture of someone who had decided that wanting things led to loss, and had constructed a philosophy around not wanting. She recognized it because she had tried the same thing after Robert died, and it had not worked for her either. The first real conversation they had, not a brief exchange about broken benches or town matters, happened on a September evening, 6 weeks after her arrival. She had stayed late at the schoolhouse grading compositions and was walking home past the Marshal's office when she saw the lamp still burning inside. She stopped. She should not have stopped. She told herself she was stopping because she wanted to ask about a matter of town business. The water barrel near the school had developed a leak, and she wanted to know who was responsible for maintaining it. She knocked. He opened the door looking tired, with his jacket off and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows and papers spread across his desk, and for a moment they both simply looked at each other in the soft yellow light of the lamp. "Miss Archer," he said, "is something wrong?" "Water barrel near the school is leaking," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "That is a matter for the town council. The town council meets on the first Thursday of the month. That is 3 weeks away. The barrel will be empty by then." He considered this. "I will speak to Jed Holloway at the hardware store tomorrow morning." "Thank you." She did not leave. She was not sure why she did not leave. "You are working late." "There is always something to work on," he said. "Is it the Hargrove matter?" His expression shifted very slightly, not alarm, but something close to it. "What do you know about the Hargrove matter?" "I know that he owns the mortgage on the school building," she said. "I know he sent a man to speak to me last week about adjusting the curriculum to exclude certain topics." Paul's jaw tightened. "What topics?" "The rights of property owners, the obligations of elected officials, basic civic knowledge." She paused. "I told the man that the curriculum was not his to adjust." "And what did the man say?" "He said that Harlow's Creek was a town that rewarded cooperation and punished stubbornness." She met Paul's eyes steadily. "I told him I would keep that in mind." Paul looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, his face was all sharp angles and careful restraint, and Sallie had the sudden distinct impression that there was something underneath that restraint that was very far from cold. "Miss Archer," he said, "I would advise you to be careful." "I am always careful," she said. "I am also stubborn. These are not mutually exclusive." She went home. She lay awake for a long time, and she told herself it was because of the Hargrove problem, because of the school, because of the water barrel. She told herself it had nothing to do with the look on Paul Hadley's face when she had said she was stubborn, that slight, arrested, almost smile that he had pulled back before it could fully form, as though he had not intended to let it out. She told herself a great many things that autumn that turned out not to be true. October brought the first real crisis. Silas Hargrove had spent the summer consolidating his position, quietly buying up the remaining mortgages in town, and ensuring that any business owner who had borrowed money from his bank understood that their loans could be called in at will. When the Reyes family, a Mexican family who had homesteaded south of town, one of the oldest families in the county, refused to sell their land to Hargrove's man at a price that amounted to theft, Hargrove sent Cutter Briggs and 2 associates to deliver a message. The message was delivered as fire. The Reyes family got out. Their house did not. Their barn did not. Their winter stores did not. They arrived in Harlow's Creek on a Friday morning with 7 children, and the clothes on their backs, and 20 years of work turned to ash behind them. Sallie heard about it before Paul did because Maria Reyes came to the schoolhouse where her eldest daughter attended, and Sallie was already there. She listened to everything Maria said. She looked at the children, 7 of them, ranging from 4 to 17, cold and shaken and trying not to show it. Then she started making a list. By noon she had organized a collection of food, blankets, and building materials from a third of the town. By 3 in the afternoon, she had arranged for the Reyes family to use the empty building next to the church while repairs were made. By evening she had spoken to 6 families who had skills: carpentry, masonry, roofing, and extracted promises from each of them. She also wrote a very detailed letter to the county recorder's office describing what she knew of the fire and asking for a formal investigation, and she mailed it before anyone could tell her not to. Paul Hadley found out about the fire at midday and went directly to the Ray's property to investigate. By the time he came to find Sallie that evening, she had already done most of the work that he had planned to spend the next 3 days doing. He stood in the temporary shelter where the Ray's family was eating dinner, a real dinner, hot and plentiful, organized by Sallie, and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Later, when the family was settled and Sallie was walking back to the schoolhouse with her own children in tow, Paul fell into step beside her. "You organized all of this today," he said. "Someone had to." "I was going to. You were investigating, which was the right thing for you to be doing," she said. The family needed both things done at once. He was quiet for half a block. Then he said, "You wrote to the county recorder." She glanced at him sideways. "How do you know that?" "Vera Dunn told me. She thought I should know." A pause. "She was right." "I will not apologize for it," Sallie said. "I am not asking you to," he said with a measured patience that somehow managed to convey both approval and a complicated worry. "I am telling you because Hargrove will find out. He has people at the recorder's office. Then he will find out that I am not afraid of him." "Miss Archer." Paul stopped walking. She stopped too. The children were a few paces ahead, Thomas holding Clara's hand, and in the dark October street with the wind pushing dust along the ground, Paul Hadley looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Hargrove is a dangerous man. He has resources and men and no conscience. Your bravery is admirable, but bravery does not stop a bullet." The word hung in the air. Sallie looked at him for a moment at the severity of his concern and felt something move in her chest that was not quite comfortable. "Neither does cowardice," she said quietly. "It just makes the bullet easier to live with after." He stared at her. Then he said very quietly, "No, I suppose it does not." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before, the kind that has too many words in it, all of them waiting. November arrived and the school was full. Sallie had 15 students by the second week, including 3 who had never attended a day of school in their lives. She taught reading and arithmetic and history and civics, and on Fridays she read aloud from whatever books she had. She had packed 6 from St. Louis and had borrowed 3 more from the county library by post. The children ranged from 5 to 14, and she handled all of them in the same room with the calm efficiency of someone who had been born organized and had been made patient by necessity. Thomas thrived. He had been quiet and withdrawn since his father's death, and there was something about being in a classroom, even one where his mother was the teacher, that began to restore him. He was the best reader in the school and he knew it, and this gave him a particular seriousness that the other children respected without entirely understanding. Clara was 5 and was not in the school officially, but sat in the back corner during lessons with Evangeline the rag doll, and absorbed everything in the concentrated way that very young children do when they feel safe. She had decided early on that Paul Hadley was one of her favorite people, on the grounds that he always spoke to her directly rather than over her head, and she had told him so, which had made Paul laugh, a real laugh, the kind that surprised him, and which Sallie had heard from the doorway and stored carefully in the part of herself she was pretending did not exist. The crisis with Hargrove deepened in November. 2 more families were pressured into selling. A man named Horatio Wells, who had spoken publicly against Hargrove at a town meeting, found his freight contracts suddenly canceled by every business Hargrove controlled. Paul had evidence of extortion, but not enough for the county judge, who was, Sallie increasingly suspected, in Hargrove's pocket. She said this to Paul in his office one cold afternoon, sitting across his desk with the petition she had been organizing spread between them. "You suspect Judge Calloway," Paul said. "It was not a question." "I more than suspect him. The timing of his rulings I know," Paul said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, in a tone that had something in it that was not entirely professional, he said, You have been gathering evidence. I have been doing what anyone with eyes and a notebook would do. Sallie, he stopped. She looked up sharply because he had never used her first name before. In 11 weeks of acquaintance he had said Miss Archer every single time, with a precision that she had begun to understand was not formality but distance, a wall he was maintaining. He seemed to realize it too because something moved across his face. He did not correct himself. She did not correct him either. She said, "I know it is dangerous. I also know that if nobody documents what is happening, it never gets corrected. The record has to exist before justice can use it. You sound like a lawyer. My husband was a teacher. He believed documentation was the foundation of civilization." She looked at the papers between them. He was right. Paul looked at her with that expression she had spent 2 months trying to categorize and failing. It was not pity and it was not admiration exactly, though it had elements of both. It was something more personal and more complicated than either. "Robert," he said carefully, "you spoke of him before." "Once," she said. "He was a good man." The question was unexpectedly gentle. Sallie felt the familiar press of grief, but it had changed shape since the summer. It was softer now, more like a scar than a wound. "He was a very good man. He loved learning and he loved his children and he died too young, which was a waste because the world needed more men like him." Paul was quiet for a moment, then carefully, "I am sorry." "Thank you." She gathered her papers. "I am going to continue gathering evidence, Marshal. You may choose whether to work with it or not." "I will work with it," he said. "I want you to know I am glad you came to Harlow's Creek." She had her papers tucked under her arm and her coat on, and she was halfway to the door, and that sentence stopped her as thoroughly as if he had reached out and taken her hand. She turned. He was still behind the desk, not moving, as though he had said the thing and was now waiting to find out what it would cost him. "I am glad too," she said, and went home before either of them could say anything else. December was cold and difficult and unexpectedly beautiful in the way that only things which contain both hardship and intimacy can be. The school had a proper stove now. Paul had arranged it quietly, without making a production of it, and when Sallie thanked him he said only that the county had funds for educational materials and a stove was arguably educational. She had looked at him. He had looked back with perfect innocence. She organized the school Christmas program, which was the first public event in Harlow's Creek in 3 years that did not involve someone getting shot or someone getting defrauded. 15 children performed recitations and a small choir. Thomas read a passage from the Gospel of Luke in a voice that did not waver, and Clara, who had not technically been invited to participate, marched up to the front and sang the first verse of "O Come All Ye Faithful" with the serene confidence of someone who knew she was doing the right thing. The town came. Even people who had been afraid to gather came, because Sallie had been careful. She had framed it as a school event, not a political meeting, and Hargrove had no grounds to object. But she had also invited the Ray's family and seated them in the front row, and she had organized a dinner afterward that required people from opposite sides of the town's fault lines to sit at the same table. Paul was there. He stood in the back, in his marshal's coat, and watched the whole thing with the expression of a man witnessing something he had not believed possible. When it was over and the room was warm with candlelight and conversation and the smell of the food Vera Dunn had organized, he found Sallie by the window. "You did this," he said. "The children did it," she said. "I just directed traffic." "Sallie," he was closer than they usually stood, and she was aware of the warmth of him and the low timbre of his voice saying her name, and the fact that her heart was doing something she had not asked it to do. "I have watched you work for 4 months. I want you to know that what you are doing, what you are building here, it matters. More than I can." He stopped. Something crossed his face. "I am not good at saying what I mean." "You are doing well so far," she said softly. He looked at her, and for a moment the careful restraint was entirely gone, and there was just a man looking at a woman he wanted very much and did not know how to reach. and a woman looking back who was trying to decide whether wanting again after grief was something she was allowed. Then Clara appeared between them, Evangeline under one arm, and said, "Marshal Hadley, Thomas says the pie is almost gone and you should come before it is all eaten." Paul looked down at Clara with an expression of mixed relief and something that was absolutely helpless in its warmth. "Well," he said, "we cannot have that." And he let himself be led away by a 5-year-old, and Sallie watched him go and allowed herself, for the first time since Robert died, to feel something that was not grief or duty or determination. She felt hope. January brought Paul Hadley's past to Harlow's Creek. His name was Dale Corwin, and he rode into town on a January morning with 3 men and a grievance he had been carrying for 6 years. Corwin was 43, built like a rain barrel, with a reputation as a bounty hunter, who did not distinguish carefully between his quarry and anyone who got in his way. He and Paul had history in Abilene, the kind of history that involved a man who had died and a question about who was responsible. Sallie heard about Corwin's arrival from Vera before noon. She went to the Marshal's office and found Paul standing in the street outside it, watching Corwin and his men at the saloon. His face was a study in controlled tension. "Old business," he said before she could ask. "How old?" 6 years. He did not look at her. "Abilene." "There was a man named Seth Corwin, Dale's brother. He was wanted for murder. I brought him in. He died in custody." A pause. "Influenza, but Dale has never believed that. And has he come to confront you or to kill you?" "In my experience, those are the same thing with Dale Corwin." Sallie looked at him. The January light was hard and clear, and Paul's profile against it was like something carved from the landscape, solid and weathered and present. She felt the fear then, the particular fear of caring about someone who stands in harm's way, and it was so specific and so certain that it confirmed everything she had been refusing to name. "What will you do?" she asked. "What I always do," he said. "Wait. Watch. Give him no grounds to act on. Corwin is a bully, but he is not entirely stupid. He will not start something he cannot finish legally. And if he does—" He turned to look at her then, and there was something in his eyes that was not simply professional concern. "I would like it very much if you stayed away from the saloon for the next few days." That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have that does not sound more frightening than it needs to. She wanted to reach out and touch his arm. She kept her hands at her sides. "Paul," she said his name carefully, "whatever happened in Abilene, whatever the truth of it was, you do not owe Dale Corwin an explanation or an apology." His jaw tightened. "What makes you so certain?" "Because I have watched you for 5 months," she said quietly, "and I know what kind of man you are." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she became aware of her own heartbeat. Then he said, with a roughness in his voice that was new, "Go home, Sallie. Take the children and stay inside today." She went. But she did not stay inside. She went to the minister's house. The church had a new minister now, Reverend Moss, who had arrived in November, and she spoke to him. Then she went to the hotel and spoke to the owner. Then she went to 3 businesses along the main street and spoke to each proprietor. By evening, when Corwin's men went to the saloon and found that 4 prominent citizens of Harlow's Creek had independently and casually positioned themselves nearby, each of them fully aware of who Corwin was and what he had done in his career, and each of them prepared to be witnesses to anything that happened, Corwin's men had a quiet conversation with their employer, and the group saddled up and left Harlow's Creek. Paul found out that evening. He came to the schoolhouse and knocked, and when Sallie opened the door, he stood on the step with the cold night air behind him and looked at her with an expression she could not have described precisely. "You organized witnesses," he said. "I organized concerned citizens who had reason to be in the vicinity," she said. "You got rid of him. He got rid of himself. I merely made the calculus unfavorable." Paul stood in the doorway for a moment, not speaking. Behind Sallie, Thomas was reading by the stove and Clara was asleep with Evangeline on the small cot that served as her bed. The schoolroom was warm and smelled of chalk and wood smoke and the soup Sallie had made for dinner. "You did that for me," he said. The directness of it startled her. She had not expected him to simply say it. She had expected the careful circumspection he usually wore. "I did it because it was right," she said. "Sallie. And because yes. Because of you." The silence between them was full to the point of breaking. Paul stepped forward into the doorway, close enough that she would have had to step back to maintain a proper distance. She did not step back. "I have been trying," he said, with a difficulty that was clearly genuine, "to behave correctly. I know. You are a widow with children in a town where my position makes me—" He stopped. "I do not want to presume." "You are not presuming," she said. Her voice was entirely steady, which impressed her because nothing else in her body was. "You are being very careful, which is kind. But I am not fragile, Paul. I am not someone who needs protecting from her own feelings." He looked at her face for a moment, searching it, and then he lifted his hand and touched her cheek with just his fingers, not holding, just touching, as if he needed to confirm she was real, and Sallie felt the warmth of it all the way to her bones. "I do not want to fail you," he said quietly. "I have a dark past and enemies who follow me, and this town is in the middle of a fight that is going to get worse before it gets better, and I am not the easiest man in the world. I am not an easy woman," she said. "I meddle in town politics, and I write letters to county officials, and I organize witness pools, and I apparently have no ability to stay out of dangerous situations." Something happened to his expression then. The last of the careful restraint gave way, and underneath it was a warmth so genuine and so intense that she caught her breath. "No," he said, and the almost smile finally became a real one which transformed his face entirely. "You do not." He did not kiss her that night. He squeezed her hand and she held it for a moment, and then he said good night and walked back down the dark street. But something had been said between them that did not require words to understand, and Sallie stood in the doorway until he was out of sight, and then she closed the door and leaned against it, and felt her heart doing something entirely undignified. Behind her, without looking up from his book, Thomas said, "I like him." "Go to sleep, Thomas," Sallie said. "I do, though," he said. "I know," she said. "Go to sleep." February arrived with a blizzard that kept the town inside for 4 days and then released them into a hard, bright cold that made everything glitter. It also arrived with Silas Hargrove's next move. Hargrove had been watching Sallie since October. He had not acted directly against her because he was calculating, not reckless, and because attacking a schoolteacher with children would have generated exactly the kind of attention he did not want. But the letter to the county recorder had been noticed, and a petition she had been circulating quietly, person by person, about his extortion of the town's businesses had reached 30 signatures, and Hargrove had decided that Sallie Archer needed to be managed. He came to the schoolhouse himself, a Sunday when the children were not there. He was a tall man, 60 years old, with silver hair and an expensive coat, and the polished manner of someone who had once had genuine charm, and had gradually replaced it with something that merely resembled it. "Miss Archer," he said, sitting without being invited to. "I believe we have started off on the wrong foot." "I do not believe we have started on any foot at all," Sallie said. "We have barely spoken." "No," he agreed, "but your actions speak considerably." He looked around the schoolroom with an expression of benevolent assessment. "This is a fine school. It would be a shame if the building's mortgage were to become complicated." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hargrove?" "It is an observation about financial realities." He smiled. "I am a reasonable man, Miss Archer. I support education. I have no desire to see this school close. I simply think that a teacher's role is to teach, not to involve herself in the complicated politics of commerce and land." "I teach civics," she said. "Civic engagement is not political involvement. It is education in practice." He looked at her steadily. "Your petition," he said, "is a dangerous thing. It will make people who are currently comfortable very uncomfortable." "That is something justice frequently does," she said. His eyes narrowed very slightly. "I can make your stay in Harlow's Creek either very comfortable or very difficult. The choice is not mine to make. It is yours." "Then I choose difficult," she said. I have never found comfortable to be particularly worth having. Hargrove stood. His charm had evaporated, and what was underneath it was considerably less pleasant. "You are a foolish woman," he said, not loudly, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. "Your husband is dead, and you are alone with 2 children in a town you do not understand. I would advise you not to force the situation." "I would advise you," she said, and her voice did not shake at all, "to speak to the county attorney before you do anything further, because the letter I sent him last Tuesday contained a very thorough record of your activities over the past 8 months, and I understand he is inclined to take it seriously." Hargrove's face went still. "You wrote to the county attorney, and to the state land commissioner," she said, "and to the editor of the Dodge City newspaper, who finds stories about land extortion in small towns to be of great interest to his readers." A silence. "Good day, Mr. Hargrove," she said. He left without another word. Sallie sat down when he was gone because her legs had decided to stop cooperating, and she pressed her hands flat on the desk and breathed slowly until they steadied. Then she went to the marshal's office. Paul was there, and when she told him what Hargrove had said, she watched his expression travel through concern, through anger, through something that was not quite either, something that was protective in a way that had nothing to do with his job. "You should have told me he was coming," he said. "I did not know, and I handled it." "Sallie, he threatened you directly." "He threatened my mortgage," she said, "which is different and which I have now addressed by ensuring that his activities are documented beyond what he can suppress locally." Paul stood and came around the desk, and she realized he was very close to her, close enough that she could see the worry in his face as something distinct from the professional concern. He usually wore something personal, something that belonged to her specifically. "You are brilliant," he said, "and you terrify me." "Those are not mutually exclusive either," she said. He laughed. It was quiet and warm, and it did something to the tightness in her chest that she had been carrying since Hargrove walked out the door. She leaned forward very slightly, almost without deciding to, and he put his hands on her shoulders, gently, carefully, and she rested her forehead against his collarbone for approximately 3 seconds, which was exactly as long as she needed to feel that the world was not entirely composed of men who wanted to take things from people. He did not speak. He held her shoulders with a steadiness that was entirely characteristic of him, and then she straightened and stepped back, and they looked at each other with the particular expression of 2 people who have acknowledged something important without saying it. "I am going to speak to the county attorney in person," he said. "I will go to Dodge City." "When?" "End of the week. It will take 2 days there and back." A pause. "I do not want to leave while the situation with Hargrove is unsettled." "The situation with Hargrove will be unsettled for months," she said. "Go, get the formal process moving. That matters more than your being here to watch over me." He looked at her. "I mean that kindly," she said. "I know how you mean it," he said. "I am going." Another pause, and then with a quiet deliberateness that made her heart do the undignified thing again. "When I come back, I would like to speak to you about something." "About Hargrove?" "No," he said, "not about Hargrove." She looked at him and he looked at her, and they both understood precisely what had just been said. "All right," she said. "I will be here." He went to Dodge City on Friday. While he was gone, Sallie taught school and organized the collection of affidavits from Hargrove's victims. 7 families who were now willing to put their names to paper. She visited each one personally in the evenings, and she sat at their kitchen tables and listened to their fear and their anger, and she wrote what they told her in her careful, precise hand. She also taught Thomas to shoot with the rifle. It was a practical matter. She had owned the Winchester since Robert died, having made a sober assessment of what a widow with children in the frontier West needed in order to be responsible, and she believed in knowing how to use what she owned. Thomas was 8 and serious, and he learned quickly and without drama, and afterward he said, "Papa would have thought that was sensible," which was such an accurate assessment of Robert Archer's character that Sallie had to turn away for a moment. Paul came back on Sunday evening. He came first to the schoolhouse, not to his office. She heard his horse and was at the door before he knocked, which said everything about where her attention had been for 2 days. He looked tired and road dusty and relieved to see her in a way he was not trying to conceal. "The county attorney is interested," he said, "more than interested. He has been watching Hargrove for years and has been waiting for documentation he could use. What you sent him was more than he expected." "Good," she said. He came inside. The children were asleep. She made coffee, real coffee, the good kind which she saved for significant occasions, and they sat at the small table, and he told her about Dodge City and she told him about the affidavits. And then the practical conversation ran out, and there was a silence that was different from the ones before. "You said you wanted to speak to me about something," she said. "I did." He was looking at his coffee, then he looked up. "I would like to court you properly, Sallie, if you are willing." She had known it was coming. She had been prepared for it. None of that preparation made it any less significant when he actually said it in that direct, quiet way that was so characteristic of him. No performance, no elaborate language, just the thing itself. "Paul," she said. "I understand if—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "Yes. Yes, I am willing." He looked at her. The tiredness was still there in his face, and the dust from the road, and underneath both of them was something that was purely and simply happy in a way that he had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. It made him look younger. "I am glad," he said. "So am I," she said. They finished the coffee. He went home. Nothing had changed and everything had changed, and Sallie washed the cups and checked on the children and then stood in the dark schoolroom for a moment, in the silence, and thought about the extraordinary thing that was happening to her, that she had walked into a broken town carrying grief and had found in the wreckage something she had not been looking for and had no intention of giving up. Spring came to Harlow's Creek slowly and then all at once, the way it always did in Kansas. A week of mud and cold, and then a single morning when the light was different and the air smelled of something new. March and April were the best months Sallie had experienced since Robert died, and she allowed herself to be happy in them without qualification. Paul courted her with a seriousness that was entirely consistent with his character. He came to the schoolhouse on Sunday afternoons with flowers that were not elaborate and conversation that was. He took her walking along the creek when the weather allowed. He was careful of her reputation and careful of the children and careful of her, in the specific way of a man who knows that the person in front of him has been hurt and has chosen to be careful anyway, not because she is fragile, but because she deserves care. He told her more about Abilene. Not all of it, but more. He told her that Seth Corwin had indeed died of influenza and that he had done nothing wrong in the matter, but that being blameless did not mean being unaffected, and that the years afterward had made him hard in ways he was still undoing. She told him about the last months of Robert's illness, about the fear and the helplessness and the particular silence that a house develops when someone is dying in it. They did not handle each other's grief with false comfort. They handled it with honesty, which was better. Thomas, who was not a demonstrative child, began leaving his best drawings on Paul's desk at the Marshal's office, not as an explicit overture, but as a form of communication that Paul understood and responded to by displaying them on the wall, which Thomas saw and did not acknowledge but was clearly pleased by. Clara, who was entirely demonstrative, simply adopted Paul as a fixture of her life, and operated on the assumption that this was settled and everyone was aware of it. She told Vera Dunn that Marshal Hadley was going to be her new father, which Vera told Sallie with enormous satisfaction, and which Sallie relayed to Paul with a mixture of amusement and genuine emotion, and Paul said with the careful evenness he brought to things that moved him, "And what did you say to Vera?" "I said that Clara was a remarkable judge of character," Sallie said. Paul looked at her. "That is a very diplomatic answer." "I thought so," she said. The Hargrove investigation came to a head in late April. The county attorney, a sharp man named Holland Croft, arrived in Harlow's Creek with 2 deputies and a warrant for Hargrove's arrest on charges of extortion, fraud, and arson. The arson charge related to the Rays' homestead. Hargrove's man, Cutter Briggs, was also wanted. Hargrove had anticipated something. Not the specific thing, but something, and he had made plans. His plan was simple and brutal. Before the county men arrived, he would use Cutter Briggs to neutralize Paul Hadley, remove the man most likely to ensure the arrest went smoothly, and create enough confusion to disappear with what he needed. It was the plan that brought Cutter Briggs to the Horseshoe Saloon on that April evening, with a gun to Paul's head. And it was why Sallie was in the saloon doorway with a Winchester. After Cutter lowered the gun, and she kept the rifle on him every second of the silence that followed, because a man who has just decided not to shoot is not the same as a man who has decided to be reasonable. Paul moved with a speed that was efficient and economical. He had his own weapon drawn before Cutter had finished the motion of lowering his arm, and he had Cutter in handcuffs in a time that Sallie later estimated at under 10 seconds. The two men with Cutter did not move. One of them looked at the Winchester, and one of them looked at Paul's face, and they both made the correct assessment. Paul said to the room, "This man is under arrest. Anyone who interferes will be similarly detained. Is that clear?" Nobody said anything. The room breathed. Paul walked Cutter Briggs to the jail. Sallie walked alongside him, and she was aware that her hands were trembling now, not visibly, she was certain, but inside her gloves, because the aftermath of fear always came after the action and never during, and she had been very afraid. At the jail, when Cutter was secured and the cell door was locked, Paul turned to her. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Are you all right?" "I am fine," she said. "You walked into a saloon with a rifle." "I did, Sallie." "You were bleeding," she said, "and you were about to be killed, and I was not prepared to allow that." He crossed the room and stood in front of her and put his hands on her face, both hands cupping her face like something precious, and he looked at her with an intensity that had passed entirely beyond professional and entirely beyond careful. "You terrify me," he said again, "but it was different now. And I love you." She blinked. The bluntness of it, the straightforward, clear directness of it, without hesitation or qualification, was so characteristic of him that it made her chest ache. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time." He kissed her. Gently, then not gently, the careful reserve giving way at last to something that had been contained too long, and she kissed him back with the full force of everything she had spent 6 months refusing to say. And the jail smelled of dust and iron, and it was entirely impractical, and she did not care at all. When they finally separated, she became aware that her rifle was still in her right hand, which she was pressing somewhat forcefully against the back of his coat. She moved it. He looked at it and then at her and began laughing, the real laugh, the one that surprised him, and she laughed too, which felt like releasing something she had been carrying. The next morning, Holland Croft arrived with his deputies, and Silas Hargrove was arrested. It was done efficiently and without drama. Paul made the arrest personally, with 2 deputies present and Croft at his side. Hargrove was taken to the county seat for trial. Judge Calloway, whose connection to Hargrove became an official matter for the state bar shortly after, resigned from the bench before the summer. Cutter Briggs was held in Harlow's Creek until a transport could come for him, and then sent to the county jail to await trial on the arson and related charges. The Rays family received a settlement from Hargrove's estate that allowed them to rebuild, and in the summer, when the new house was finished, Maria Rays came to the school and said to Sallie, "You gave us our life back," and Sallie said, "You gave yourself your life back. I just made some noise." The trial came in June. Sallie testified. She sat in the wooden chair in the county courthouse in Dodge City, and she read from her records, meticulously kept, dated and sourced and cross-referenced. And Holland Croft told her afterward that her documentation was the strongest single piece of evidence against Hargrove that the prosecution possessed. Hargrove was convicted on 6 counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth. He was 60 years old. He would not come back to Harlow's Creek. The town breathed again. It was a visible thing. You could see it in the way people walked in June, the way they spoke to each other on the street, the way the Horseshoe Saloon became a place people went for celebration rather than fear. The water barrel near the school was replaced with a proper cistern, funded by the town council, which was now composed of people who had not been selected by Silas Hargrove. The church had a full congregation again. Vera Dunn organized a community dinner that became a monthly tradition. And Paul Hadley, in June, on an evening when the sky over the Kansas plains was a color that defied any adequate description, deep gold and pink, and the blue of something that had decided to be beautiful on purpose, asked Sallie Archer to marry him. They were on the creek bank. The children were with Vera, who had become a reliable and enthusiastic accomplice in Paul's courtship. The grass was long and the water moved quietly, and Paul sat beside Sallie on the bank and said, without preamble, because he was Paul and had never seen any advantage in preamble, "I want to marry you." She looked at the water. "I know what I am asking," he said. "I have a difficult past and a dangerous profession and 2 children who are not mine, though I would like them to be, and I am not Paul," she said. "The easiest man, Paul," she said again. He stopped. "Ask me properly," she said. He looked at her. Then he took her hand, turned toward her, and said, "Sallie Archer, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Absolutely." He did not look surprised. He was not a man much given to surprise. But he looked profoundly, quietly glad in a way that was better than surprise. He pressed her hand, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they stayed on the creek bank until the light was entirely gone, talking about nothing of great consequence and everything of great consequence, in the way that 2 people who have decided on each other always do. They were married on a Saturday in July, in the church, by Reverend Moss, in front of most of Harlow's Creek. Thomas stood straight and serious in the front row and did not cry, which was a point of pride for him that Sallie understood and respected. Clara wore a yellow dress that Vera had helped make and held Evangeline with one arm and managed the flower petals with the other, scattering them with an enthusiasm that bordered on violence. Sallie wore her best dress, altered and refreshed for the occasion. Paul wore his good coat and had brushed it carefully, and when she walked down the aisle he looked at her with the full, unguarded warmth that he usually reserved for private moments, and she felt it like sunshine. Reverend Moss said the words and they said theirs, and when Paul said, "I do," it was with the same direct simplicity he brought to everything important, and when Sallie said, "I do," her voice was the steady, clear voice of a woman who means exactly what she says. Afterward, at the dinner in the church hall that Vera had organized with military precision, Paul Hadley told Sallie's children what he had been saying with his actions for months. He crouched down to their level, Thomas first, then Clara, and he said, "I cannot replace your father. I know that, and I would not try. But I am going to be here every day, and I am going to love you both, and I would be proud to be your father if you would allow it." Thomas, who was 9 by then, considered this seriously. Then he said, "Yes, I think that would be good," and he held out his hand to shake, which was so precisely the gesture of a child who had been watching his mother conduct business with men that Paul laughed and shook it with full solemnity. Clara said, "I already decided," and hugged him around the neck, which nearly knocked him sideways, and Paul put his arms around her and held on. Sallie watched this from across the room, in the middle of a conversation with Maria Reyes, and she felt something that she did not have a word for, a fullness, a completion, something that was not the erasure of grief but its transformation into something else, something that made room for joy without requiring her to pretend the loss had not been real. The summer that followed was the best of her life. Harlow's Creek, freed from Hargrove's grip, grew. Not dramatically. This was not a gold rush town with sudden wealth. It was a prairie town with steady people and hard work, but genuinely. The school grew. By September, Sallie had 22 students and was pushing the town council for a second room. New families arrived, drawn by the reputation of the town as a fair place, a stable place, a place where a person could plant roots. The Ray's family rebuilt and expanded. Vera's community dinners became an institution. Paul, as marshal of a town that was no longer afraid, became something slightly different than he had been before. He was still careful and still watchful, because the frontier was still the frontier, and there was still violence in the world, and that did not change. But something in him had eased the particular tension of a man who expects loss had loosened, and in its place was a man who was, against all his own expectations, genuinely content. He was also a remarkable father. He was not demonstrative in the way that Clara needed him to be, so he learned to be more demonstrative for her specifically, because she needed it. He was not academic in the way that Thomas needed him to be, so he read more actually read, sitting at the kitchen table with books that Sallie brought home, asking her questions that were thoughtful and sometimes unexpectedly perceptive. He attended every school event. He attended them as a parent, not as a marshal, which was a distinction that mattered to him and that Thomas, who was watching for it, recognized. On a morning in October, 15 months after Sallie had arrived in Harlow's Creek, Paul came into the schoolhouse after the children had gone to their lessons and found Sallie at her desk. He stood in the doorway and said, "I told your children something yesterday." She looked up. "What did you tell them?" He came in. He sat in one of the student chairs, which was slightly too small for him and which he had always ignored as a hindrance. "We were at the general store and Mrs. Holloway made a comment. She said she hoped the town would stay decent now that Hargrove was gone, and Thomas said something about hoping it would. And I told them," he stopped, and for a moment looked at her with an expression she could read by now as fully as she had ever read anything, the combination of feeling and precision that was purely Paul. "I told them that their mother was the reason this town has any decency left in it." The silence was complete. Sallie felt the words settle through her the way warmth settles, gradually, fully, into every part that has been cold. "Paul," she said. "It is true," he said, with the matter-of-fact certainty he brought to things he was absolutely sure of. "You came here with nothing and you built something. The school, the petitions, the evidence, the witness pool, the community dinners, every piece of what this town is now is because of what you did. I have watched it. I know exactly what this town was before you and what it is now." He looked at her steadily. "I told your children because they should know it, about their mother." She had not cried at the wedding. She had not cried during the trial or the arrests or any of the crises of the previous year, because there had always been something to do and crying had not been it. She felt the tears now, not as weakness but as the release of something that had been held in very carefully for a very long time, the emotion of being truly seen, fully and accurately by the person whose eyes mattered most. "What did they say?" she managed. The corner of his mouth curved. "Thomas said that was correct. Clara said she already knew." Sallie laughed through the tears, which was thoroughly undignified and which Paul watched with the same warm, steady attention he gave to everything she did. He came out of the small chair and crossed to her desk and stood before her, and she stood too, and he held her face in his hands the way he had in the jail like something precious and said, "I love you. That is all." "That is enough," she said. "That is more than enough." He kissed her, and outside the schoolhouse the October sun was making the Kansas plains golden, and in the churchyard 2 blocks away the new bell that the community had purchased with donated funds rang the hour, and Harlow's Creek carried on being a decent place on the back of everything that Sallie Archer Hadley had poured into it. December brought news that made the winter entirely different from the one before. Sallie, who was nothing if not practical, told Paul on a Tuesday morning before the children were awake, in the kitchen over the first coffee of the day. She had been certain for 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks deciding how to say it, which was ironic, given that she was never at a loss for words. She said, "I believe we are going to have a baby." Paul set down his coffee cup very carefully. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was entirely new, unguarded and young, and suffused with a happiness so pure it was almost startling. "Sallie," he said, "In June, I think," she said. "Perhaps July." He stood up from the table and came to her and held her, not with the careful deliberateness of their early courtship, but with the full, unreserved warmth of a man who has stopped worrying about what he is allowed to have and is simply present in what he has. "Are you well?" he asked into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am happier than I have any right to be." "You have every right," he said. Thomas took the news with the serious consideration he brought to all large information, and asked 3 specific questions about how a baby would affect the sleeping arrangements, and whether it would be able to come to school eventually, and expressed satisfaction with the answers. Clara celebrated with an enthusiasm so total that Evangeline the rag doll was launched into the air twice, which Sallie took as approval. The baby arrived in late June, a boy, which delighted Thomas in a way he tried to conceal behind practicality, and failed to conceal even slightly, and they named him Robert James Hadley. Robert for the father who had gone too soon, and James for Paul's own father, which Sallie had suggested, and which Paul received with a quietness that said everything. Robert James Hadley arrived in the world with a set of lungs that Vera Dunn, who was present, said could be heard from the end of the street, and with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and with Thomas watching from the doorway with an expression so uncharacteristically open with wonder that Sallie filed it away as one of the things she would keep forever. Clara sat beside the baby for the first hour of his life and explained, in a serious and thorough voice, who everyone was and what the arrangements of the household were and where he would be sleeping, and held his tiny fist with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with her usual approach to life. Paul held his son for the first time in the evening when the room had gone quiet and the summer light was long through the window. He held him with a carefulness that was different from competence, not nervous exactly, but aware, in the particular way of someone understanding the weight of what they hold. He looked at Sallie. She looked back. The baby made a small sound and settled. "Thank you," Paul said, not to the baby, to her. "I seem to recall you had some involvement," she said. He laughed quietly, careful not to disturb the baby, and the laugh was warm and full, and it was, Sallie thought, the sound of a man who no longer believed that wanting things would cost him everything. The years that followed were full of school and seasons, and the steady work of building a life in a place that now felt entirely like home. Harlow's Creek grew into itself, a town that had faced its worst and made choices about the kind of place it wanted to be. The second room of the school was built in 1884. By 1885, Sallie had a teaching assistant, a young woman named Dora Fisher who had arrived with her family from Nebraska and who was sharp and eager and reminded Sallie, somewhat, of herself. Thomas grew into a young man of 16 who had decided he wanted to study law. He said this to Paul one evening after dinner, in the careful way of someone making an announcement he has rehearsed, and Paul said, with a precision that made Thomas straighten with pride, "You would be an excellent lawyer. The territory needs men who can think clearly and who know what justice looks like in practice." Clara, at 14, was the most social creature in Harlow's Creek. She organized events and knew everyone and had strong opinions about everything, and she had inherited her mother's ability to walk into a difficult situation and make it better by virtue of pure determined competence. She was also already an excellent teacher's assistant, though she had not yet decided whether teaching was what she wanted. Robert, at 4, was chaos. He was cheerful and loud and got into everything and had a laugh that could shift the mood of an entire room, and he adored his siblings and his father with the total, uncomplicated love of a child who has never known anything but security. In the autumn of 1886, a second baby arrived, a girl they named Helen, which had been Paul's mother's name. Thomas was by then at the age of 17, preparing to go east to study, and when he held Helen for the first time he said, very quietly, that he was glad she would know a good town. "Because of you," he said to his mother, "what you built here, Sallie looked at him, this serious young man who had been a serious small boy when she arrived in Harlow's Creek carrying grief in a carpetbag, and she said, "What we built, all of us." Thomas considered this. "Paul says you were the reason," he said. "Paul is generous," she said. "Paul is honest," Thomas said. "You know he is always honest." She did know. She had known it from the beginning, from the careful directness of a man who did not know how to be anything else. It was one of the things she loved most about him. Paul was 40 when Helen was born, and he was, if anything, more himself than he had been at 34, the carefulness still there, the precision and the watchfulness, but without the tightness underneath. He had made peace with Abilene in a way that had been gradual and quiet and would never be entirely complete, but that no longer ran the operations of his life. He still wore the star every day and still took his duties as seriously as he had always done. But he came home to a house that was full and warm and complicated and alive, and this had changed the context of everything. On Thomas's last evening at home, before leaving for the train to Kansas City and the East, the whole family had dinner together. Vera Dunn came, and the Ray's family and Reverend Moss and half a dozen people who had been part of Harlow's Creek story. After dinner, when the room had cleared down to family, Paul said to Thomas, "Write when you arrive." "I will," Thomas said, "and when things are difficult." Paul looked at the young man who had handed him a drawing 8 years ago as a form of introduction, and who was now almost as tall as he was, and said, "Because they will be." "I know," Thomas said. "You told me." "I told you the facts," Paul said. "I want you to remember the whole thing. The difficult parts are not the whole story." Thomas looked at his father, his stepfather, though neither of them used the word in a way that made it sound like something less, and said, "I know. You showed me that." They embraced. It was not a brief or a formal embrace. It was the embrace of a man and the son he had chosen, and it lasted long enough to matter. When Thomas left the next morning, Clara cried openly and Robert cried because Clara was crying and Helen was too small to know what was happening. Paul stood with Sallie and watched the stagecoach until it was out of sight, and she took his hand and he held it, and they stood together in the September morning outside the building that had been a school for 4 years and was now a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms and a proper stove and 28 students. "He is going to be extraordinary," Paul said. "He already is," she said. "That is your doing." "It is his doing," she said firmly. "We just didn't get in the way." He smiled at that, the full smile, the one that still transformed his face, and he kept her hand as they walked back toward the house, where Clara was managing Helen with practiced competence and Robert was doing something to the kitchen that would require investigation. Harlow's Creek in 1887 was a different place than it had been in 1882. It was larger and more stable and had a functioning court system and a town council that was elected honestly and a marshal's office that had the respect of the county. It had a church with a full congregation and a school with 2 rooms and a community dinner on the 3rd Sunday of every month. It had a newspaper now, a small one, run by a man named Orson Leak who was relentlessly fair. It had doctors and lawyers and merchants, and it had the kind of ordinary, unglamorous, daily decency that is the foundation of every good thing. On a November evening in 1887, Vera Dunn organized a community gathering that was ostensibly a harvest dinner, and was actually, as became clear, a celebration of the 5th anniversary of the school. She had planned it in secret, which was not easy to do in a small town, and she had asked people to contribute memories and had compiled them into a small handwritten book. She presented it to Sallie at the dinner in front of everyone with a speech that was precisely as long as it needed to be. "This town was dying when you arrived," Vera said. "I do not say that for drama. I say it because it is accurate. We were afraid. We were shrinking. Good people were leaving and bad people were consolidating. You came with 2 children and a carpetbag, and you started a school, and you wrote letters, and you organized dinners, and you made records, and you stood in saloon doorways with rifles when the situation required it. And slowly, over 5 years, this town remembered that it had the right to be decent. There was applause. Real applause, the kind that comes from the chest and not just the hands. Vera handed her the book. Sallie held it and looked at the room, at the faces she knew, at Maria Reyes with her children, at the families who had given affidavits, at the students who had grown 3 years in her classroom, at Clara beside Robert, who was asleep against her shoulder, at Paul, who was standing at the back of the room with Helen in his arms and his eyes on Sallie with the full, steady, unqualified love of a man who has been paying attention. She said, "I am grateful to this town. Everything I am, that is worth anything has been made here, or made stronger here. The school exists because you sent your children to it. The courage exists because you had it first and shared it. I did not build this alone." She looked at Paul. "I have never done anything alone since the day I arrived." He had not moved. He was still holding Helen, who had one fist curled into the lapel of his coat, and he was looking at Sallie with the expression she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life: absolute, unshielded love. After, when the dinner had concluded and the room was clearing and the children were gathered and coats were being found, Paul came to her. He was still carrying Helen, who was now determinedly awake and watching the world with the focused curiosity that was already characteristic of her. He stood before Sallie and said, quietly enough that it was just between them, "I told your children, Thomas and Clara, years ago that you were the reason this town has any decency left in it." "I know," she said. "Thomas told me." "I meant it then," he said. "I mean it now more than I did then." "Paul," she said, and her voice was soft with everything the years had made between them, the closeness and the trust and the particular joy of knowing someone truly, across time, across difficulty, across everything. "I just want you to know," he said. "I want you to know that I see what you do and what you have done. I want you to know that when I say I love you, it includes all of it, the school and the letters and the Winchester and the stubbornness and the way you sat with Maria Reyes and the way you taught Thomas to shoot and the way you walked into the most frightening situations of my life like they were simply problems to be solved." He looked at her. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever known." She took Helen from him, the warm weight of their daughter against her shoulder, and reached up with her free hand and touched his face. "You are not so unremarkable yourself," she said. He laughed. Helen reacted to the laugh with delight, which made him laugh more. Clara appeared with Robert in tow and said that Robert had eaten approximately 7 biscuits and might be sick, which redirected everyone's attention with efficient necessity. They walked home through the November dark, the 5 of them, in the cold and clean air of the Kansas night. The town was quiet around them, the ordinary quiet of a place that is settled and safe. The kind of quiet that has to be built, person by person, decision by decision, year by year. Above them the stars were extraordinary, as they always were on the plains, spread across the black sky in a display that made the world feel both vast and, at this particular moment, entirely sufficient. Sallie walked with Paul's arm around her and Helen against her chest, and the sounds of her children around her, and she thought about the morning she had stepped off a stagecoach in a broken town with a carpetbag and a grief so large it had reshaped her. She thought about the letter from her cousin that had said there was opportunity here for a brave woman, and she thought that her cousin had been right, though not in any of the ways either of them had expected. The opportunity had not been the school, though the school mattered. It had not been the fight against Hargrove, though that mattered too. The opportunity had been this specific, improbable, entirely real life that had grown in the space between arriving and choosing, between surviving and building, between grief and love. She had built a school in Harlow's Creek, and she had built something else too, something quieter and more lasting, and she was walking home inside it with her children's voices in the air around her and Paul Hadley's arm steady at her back. Inside the house, they put the children to bed in the particular organized chaos of a family that knows its own routines, Robert protesting against sleep, until Clara read to him, which always worked. Helen settling with the immediate trust of someone who had never had reason not to. And a letter on the table from Thomas arrived that afternoon, describing his classes and a friend he had made and ending with the sentence, "Tell everyone in Harlow's Creek that I think about it more than I expected to." Paul read the letter twice. He set it down on the table and smiled at it privately, in the way he smiled at things that moved him when he was not expecting to be moved. "He is well," Sallie said. "He is more than well," Paul said. He looked up at her. "He is yours, that is what makes the difference." "He is ours," she said. They sat at the kitchen table together in the lamplight, late, after the house had gone to sleep, and they talked about Thomas and about the school, and about a conversation Paul had had that week with a new family arriving in Harlow's Creek who had heard it was a good place to settle, and about whether the second story of the school should wait until spring or could be begun in February if the weather held, and about Helen's eyes, which were definitely gray, which was Paul's. Then they did not talk about anything in particular. They sat in the warmth of the lamp and the warmth of each other, and outside the Kansas night was cold and immense and full of stars, and Harlow's Creek was quiet with the deep, earned quiet of a town that had decided to be decent and had held to that decision. And inside the lamplit kitchen of a house that had been built on grief and love and stubbornness and 7 months of circulating petitions, Sallie and Paul Hadley were entirely, unambiguously, permanently home. The years ahead would hold more of everything, more school years, more students, more of Thomas's letters as his career took shape, Clara growing into herself and eventually finding her own path with the same fierce, organizational competence she had always had, Robert growing loud and cheerful and kind, Helen growing curious and bookish and serious in a way that made Thomas smile when he visited for Christmas in 1890 and said, looking at his youngest sister, "She is like you, Mama," and looked at Paul and said, "And like you." More community dinners and more winters and more springs that came all at once in the Kansas way. More moments in the schoolhouse when Sallie looked at a child's face when something clicked into understanding, which never got old. More evenings on the creek bank. More stars. And through all of it, the Marshal star on Paul Hadley's chest and the schoolroom chalk on Sallie Archer Hadley's fingers, and the knowledge between them daily, solid, held like everything that matters, that they had found each other in a broken town and had helped to make it whole, and had built a life inside that wholeness that was as good as anything the frontier had ever offered to anyone who was brave enough to reach for it. Harlow's Creek endured, the decent place that a woman had helped make decent. The loyal Marshal told her children that their mother was the reason this town had any decency left in it, and he was right. And it was also true that the town had given her back everything it owed, in full, with interest, in the currency of belonging and love and home.